In the late frontier winters, when the wind cut like a blade and temperatures plunged far below. Freezing, most prospectors believed there was only one way to survive: build the thickest, heaviest, most rugged log cabin possible and keep a roaring fire going all night long. Bigger walls meant more safety, more timber meant more warmth. That was the rule no one questioned. Until one quiet, odd-looking prospector set up a strange little tent on the edge of camp, a tent so flimsy and so laughable that everyone assumed he would either freeze to death or come begging for space in someone else's cabin by the end of the first night. His tent looked like a joke. Layers of canvas stitched together with a patchwork technique nobody recognized. A small stove barely larger than a bucket, and a floor made not of wood planks, but of dried moss and bark packed under heavy canvas. While the others spent weeks felling trees and building full cabins, he worked alone for just a few days, moving methodically, cutting moss blocks, sealing seams, and building what they thought was a ridiculous soft house. The men laughed at him openly. They told him real structures needed real walls. They joked that he should carve his tombstone early, but when the first true winter storm hit, the kind that made even the sturdiest roofs groan and the strongest men shiver, the joke began to lose its humor. Cabin fires sputtered through the night, hungry for fuel, sending most of their heat straight up the chimneys and out into the frozen air. Drafts snuck through every crack in the log walls. Cold air pooled on the floors where men slept, pulling warmth out of their blankets. Prospector after prospector woke up through the night, stumbling barefoot to the fire, tossing in more logs, feeding the flames just to keep the room above freezing. But the man in the strange tent, he slept soundly, deeply, warmly. When the storm finally calmed, the astonished prospectors trudged out to check on him, half expecting to find a frozen corpse, and instead found him stepping out of his tent in a cloud of warm steam, stretching comfortably, like he had just woken from the best sleep of the season. Curious and embarrassed, they asked how cold it had been inside. He shrugged and said he didn't know, maybe warm enough to take off my jacket. When they measured it properly later, the truth stunned them. His tent had stayed almost 45 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than their log cabins. That shouldn't have been possible. A tent wasn't supposed to outperform a cabin. It wasn't supposed to trap heat, withstand heavy storms, or keep the ground from freezing. And yet, somehow, this strange contraption had done exactly that. The secret was something most frontiersmen never thought about: airtight design and full-surface insulation. His triple-layer tent wasn't just canvas. The first layer blocked wind, the second trapped warm air, and the innermost layer, made from stitched wool scraps, acted like a giant blanket wrapped around the entire structure. While cabins leaked warmth from every join between logs, his tent had almost no drafts at all. The stove radiated heat evenly across the enclosed space instead of shooting it out through a chimney. And the insulated ground layer, made from dry moss and bark, stopped the earth from sucking heat downward, something cabins rarely protected against. The result was a thermal bubble. Once warm, the tent stayed warm for hours with minimal fuel. Meanwhile, the cabins needed constant firewood, constant attention, and constant struggling just to keep from freezing. The tent wasn't magic, it was engineering. It used principles the prospectors didn't understand at the time: thermal mass, airflow control, radiant heat retention, and ground insulation. Even the sloped shape of the tent helped. It reduced empty air volume, so the stove didn't have to overwork to fill a large space. As the winter wore on, the difference only became more dramatic. Cabin walls frosted over on the inside. Water buckets froze solid. Breath turned to ice in midair. But the man in the strange tent continued living almost comfortably, burning only a fraction of the firewood everyone else consumed. He cooked meals without shivering. He woke without frost on his blankets. He even invited a couple of the skeptics to sit inside one night, and within minutes they removed their gloves and rubbed their hands together in disbelief. Word spread across the camp, then across neighboring claims. The warmest structure in the valley wasn't a cabin, wasn't a dugout, wasn't even a winterized shelter. It was a handmade tent, built by a man everyone had dismissed as foolish. Eventually, the laughter turned to curiosity, and curiosity turned to imitation. A few prospectors tried building their own insulated tents, copying what they could remember from his design. Some succeeded partially, others failed completely. Because it wasn't just the materials, it was the understanding of airflow, insulation, and efficiency. The man never bragged about it. He wasn't a show-off, and he wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He had simply learned from Arctic trappers, native winter hunters, and traveling craftsmen who understood that warmth doesn't come from thick walls alone. It comes from smart design. In the end, the lesson became legendary in some frontier communities. Heavy doesn't mean warm, big doesn't mean efficient, and the smartest shelter isn't always the one that looks the toughest. The strange little tent that everyone mocked taught the frontier a simple but lasting truth. Survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the one who understands how the cold really works. And long after the cabins rotted away, long after the gold dried up, the story of the tent that stayed 45 degrees warmer lived on. One of the most surprising examples of practical frontier engineering the wilderness had ever seen.